Hey guys, tonight we're doing something that history books criminally undercovered. What medieval people actually did for fun. Not the peasant dies in a field part, not the plague part, not even the part where your teeth fall out from chewing a loaf of bread that's roughly the consistency of a parking curb. Tonight we're talking about the stuff people did when they weren't dying, suffering, or praying desperately not to do either. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you. Medieval people had free time. Not a lot of it, but some. And they used it in the most gloriously unhinged ways imaginable. Before we go any further, I want to say a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. Your suggestion landed in the comments and immediately made me think, yes, this is exactly the kind of thing that deserves a full investigation. The channel only grows because of people like you, and that means the world. If you're enjoying what we do here, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure, no guilt trip, just genuine appreciation if you do. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. And if you prefer to drift off to this on Spotify, we're there too. Check the description for the link, now. Dim those lights. Turn on a fan for that soft white noise in the background. Pull your blanket all the way up. Let your phone rest somewhere nearby and your eyes go a little soft. Before we begin, I have some questions for you. Have you ever wondered what medieval people did on a Sunday afternoon when they weren't ploughing a field? Did they have hobbies? Did they have inside jokes? Did they have that one guy at the village party who always takes things too far? Was there a medieval equivalent of someone who gets way too competitive at board games and flips the table? Did people have favourite songs? Did they gossip? Did they drink too much and do something deeply embarrassing in front of the lord of the manor? And perhaps most importantly, if you had no electricity, no streaming services, no phone, no takeout, and your only entertainment options were a village, a field, and your neighbours, how would you even begin to fill an evening? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1310. It's a Saturday. You've finished your work for the day, barely, and now you have a few precious hours that are technically yours. No one is asking you to plough anything. No one is currently dying nearby. The sun is still up. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear someone playing a pipe badly, but enthusiastically. Welcome to medieval leisure. Try to enjoy it before Monday ruins everything. Let's start at the centre of nearly every good time in medieval life. The table. Not your table, the communal one, the long one set up in the middle of the village or the great hall, where everyone from the blacksmith to the lord's least favourite nephew crammed in shoulder to shoulder and ate until they couldn't breathe. Feast days were not casual affairs. They were events with anticipation, preparation, and a social electricity that your average Thursday night dinner simply cannot replicate. Food was piled high, roasted meats, pottages, loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, and enough ale to make everyone temporarily forget about the rent they owed. It was loud, it was crowded, it smelled extraordinary, and it was genuinely, legitimately one of the highlights of medieval life. Think of it less like a dinner party, and more like the medieval version of a music festival, except the headliner was a roasted pig and the encore was someone's uncle falling off a bench. Now, it's important to understand that feast days were not a casual Tuesday thing. They were tied to the religious calendar, which in medieval Europe was absolutely packed. Saints' days, holy days, harvest celebrations, wedding feasts, christenings. The church provided approximately 115 days per year that were technically non-working holidays, and while not all of those produced full communal feasts, the good ones absolutely did. You spent weeks knowing the feast was coming. You planned around it. You looked forward to it with the particular intensity of someone who has been eating turnip pottage for the last 40 days straight, and knows that at some point soon there will be meat. The preparation alone was an event. In great households, the kitchen staff worked for days. Pigs were slaughtered, bread was baked in enormous quantities, spit-roasted meats turned slowly over fires that had been going since before dawn. Sauces were made from combinations of spices that a peasant would never see in his regular life. Saffron, ginger, cinnamon, imported at eye-watering cost and deployed specifically because the expense was the point. In village settings, the preparation was more collective, with different families contributing different things, which meant the feast also involved several days of negotiation, pride, mild rivalry, and at least one person who showed up with something nobody asked for and expected appreciation anyway. Seating at the feast was not casual. Where you sat told everyone in the room exactly who you were. At noble feasts, the high table sat on a raised platform at one end of the hall, where the lord and his most important guests ate better food, from better dishes, and were served first. Everyone else arranged themselves down the hall in descending order of importance, with the least significant people sitting at the farthest end, where the draughts were worst and the food had sometimes cooled slightly by the time it arrived. It was, in other words, exactly like a wedding reception, except the politics were life and death rather than merely family drama. The food itself could be elaborate beyond what most people ate in a month. Wealthy feasts featured dishes called subtleties, sculptural confections made from sugar and almond paste, shaped into castles, animals, and coats of arms, designed to be looked at before being eaten. Swans were sometimes served redressed in their own feathers, which sounds impressive until you remember that swans taste terrible, and the whole thing was purely for show. Peacocks received similar treatment. The message was clear. We are so wealthy that we'll make beautiful things out of food and then eat them in front of you. But here is the thing that the elaborate noble feast can obscure. Village feasts were also genuinely wonderful, just in a different register. The food was simpler, the hall was lower, the benches were harder, and the company was people you'd known your entire life, which meant the laughter was real, the arguments were familiar, and when the ale flowed freely enough, even the worst neighbour in the village became temporarily tolerable. By the end of the feast, the hall was warm from bodies and fire. The noise had become a comfortable roar. Someone was almost certainly asleep against the wall, and the particular medieval contentment that comes from eating too much in good company had settled over everyone like a second, heavier blanket. It wasn't refined, it wasn't quiet, but it was alive, and it was theirs. And the next morning, when the turnip pottage was back and the fields were waiting, people carried the memory of it like a small bright thing they could take out and look at whenever the work got heavy. Before there were cocktail bars and wine lists, there were taverns, low-ceilinged, smoky, perpetually damp, and absolutely full of people. The medieval tavern was less a business and more a living organism, part social club, part gossip exchange, part unofficial courthouse where half the village disagreements got settled or dramatically worsened depending on how the evening went. Ale was the drink of choice, weak enough for breakfast and strong enough by evening to make everything feel like a reasonable idea. Taverns weren't just for drinking either. They were where you heard the news, met travellers passing through, listened to stories, and occasionally watched someone get into a fight about a pig. They were the original social media, loud, unreliable, and deeply addictive. Medieval ale was not what you are currently imagining. It was not cold, it was not carbonated, and it did not come in a clean glass with a satisfying label. It was murky, warm, frequently a bit sour, brewed from whatever grain was available, and consumed in quantities that would alarm a modern nutritionist. But here is the critical thing. It was safer than water. Medieval water sources were genuinely trying to kill you. Ale involved boiling, which inadvertently killed the worst of what was lurking in the water supply. So drinking ale was not simply a leisure activity. It was also, by the standards of the time, sensible. Children drank small ale. Monks drank it. Elderly grandmothers drank it. You drank it at breakfast. The medieval pub culture was not a moral failing. It was infrastructure. The tavern itself was often just someone's house. A woman who brewed ale, an alewife, would hang a bush or a pole above her door to signal that ale was available, and people would simply come in. As towns grew, dedicated tavern buildings emerged, but even these were domestic in scale. A main room with a fire, benches, tables worn smooth from years of elbows, and a general atmosphere of casual chaos. There was no formal entertainment most nights. The entertainment was the room itself, the conversation, the argument, the story someone was telling in the corner about something that had happened 3 villages over and had already been significantly embellished by the third retelling. Travellers were a particular draw. In a world where most people rarely moved far from home, someone who had come from a distant town, or returned from a pilgrimage, or been on the road for weeks was a source of extraordinary interest. They brought news, real news, the kind you couldn't get any other way, and they brought stories, rumours, observations about places most of the room would never see. The medieval tavern was, for a few hours on any given evening, a window onto a larger world. Drinking games existed, naturally, because the combination of ale, a room full of competitive people, and nothing pressing to do in the morning has always produced the same result. Singing happened, both organised and spontaneous. Arguments about everything from local politics to the outcomes of tournaments to the correct method of ploughing a particular kind of soil erupted, escalated and eventually subsided or occasionally didn't, in which case someone got thrown out into the street and the rest of the room immediately began discussing what had just happened. The church was deeply suspicious of taverns, which is not surprising, because the church was deeply suspicious of most things that people genuinely enjoyed. Taverns were associated with gambling, with a loose conversation, with the kind of behaviour that didn't survive the Monday morning examination of conscience. Sermons warned against them. Allais was characterised as a gateway to sin with the kind of specificity that suggests whoever was writing the sermon had given the subject considerable personal research. And still the taverns were full. Every night across medieval Europe, people who had worked extremely hard in conditions that were difficult by any measure walked into low, smoky rooms and sat down with each other and drank something warm and talked until it was time to go home. It wasn't sophisticated, it wasn't grand, but it was human in the most uncomplicated possible way, and nobody needed a saint's day to justify it. In a world without books for most people, without paper, without anything you could hold and read in bed, stories were everything. And storytelling in the medieval world was not the quiet, polite kind you might imagine. Someone standing primly by a fireplace reading aloud from a leather-bound tome. It was performative, dramatic and collaborative, the kind of storytelling where the audience reacted, called out, groaned, and occasionally threw things in approval. Travelling storytellers, known as bards, troubadours or minstrels depending on where you were the closest thing medieval people had to a Netflix subscription. They arrived in a village and suddenly the whole community dropped everything, gathered around and prepared to be swept somewhere entirely else for a few hours. The stories weren't gentle either. They involved dragons, betrayals, doomed love affairs, miraculous saints, and heroes doing spectacularly stupid things for honour. A good travelling storyteller was a serious professional. He had a repertoire, a body of material that could be stretched, compressed, or adapted depending on the audience, the occasion, and how much the audience had been drinking. At a noble court, the same story that delighted a village crowd might be elevated with more elaborate language, more courtly detail, more of the specific cultural references that told a lord that this performer understood his world. At a village feast, the crude jokes could come out. The pacing changed. The performer read the room constantly, in the way that all good performers always have, adjusting in real time to what was landing and what was losing them. The stories themselves came from everywhere. Epic tales of heroes, Roland, Arthur, Alexander, Charlemagne, circulated across Europe in versions that varied from region to region, telling, adding, subtracting, adjusting the details to fit local tastes. You might hear a story about King Arthur told in England that had an entirely different ending from the version circulating in France, and both performers would be absolutely confident theirs was the correct one. Alongside the grand epics were fabliaux, comic tales, often bawdy, often featuring foolish husbands, clever wives, incompetent clergy, and the kind of plots that resolve themselves through schemes and coincidences that would embarrass a modern soap opera. These were enormously popular. People loved them. The church was not pleased. The people didn't care. Storytelling wasn't only for performers. Around the fire on any given evening, the older members of the household told stories too. Family histories, local legends, cautionary tales about what happened to the man in the next village who made a particular kind of bad decision. This oral tradition carried information that no book held, and it was how the past was transmitted. You knew your grandparents' lives through stories your parents told. You knew the history of your region not from documents, but from the accumulated narrative memory of everyone around you, shaped and reshaped by the telling. Ghost stories were, predictably, very popular. The medieval world had a vivid, detailed, and deeply felt relationship with the supernatural, and the line between a ghost story told for entertainment and genuine account of something someone believed had happened was not always clear and was possibly not a line at all. Purgatory was real. The dead returned. Strange lights appeared in fields at night. Animals behaved in ways that required explanation. A skilled storyteller could take any of these elements and construct something that made the audience press closer to the fire and glance at the darkened doorway. The best storytellers became genuinely famous, sought after by noble courts, rewarded with food and lodging and sometimes actual money, remembered by name in a world where most people left no written trace of their existence. They were a profession, an art form, and a public service rolled into one travelling adaptable firelit performance. And when a good one arrived in your village, you made sure you were there. You did not miss it. There was always time to plough the field tomorrow. Here is a thing modern life has accidentally forgotten. In the medieval world, music was not something you consumed passively with earbuds in. It was something you made. Everyone made it. The farmer, the merchant's wife, the child who could barely hold a flute, the village priest who definitely played lute at parties despite what the bishop thought about it. Instruments range from simple wooden pipes and hand drums to the slightly more sophisticated lute, rebec, and hurdy-gurdy, which sounds like a made-up word, but was an extremely real instrument that produced a deeply strange droning sound that could either be hauntingly beautiful or deeply alarming depending on who was playing it. Music was at weddings, at funerals, at feasts, at church, in fields and in taverns. It was the background track of medieval life, live and local, and occasionally very, very out of tune. The most accessible instruments were the ones you could make yourself or afford cheaply. Bone flutes, simple wooden pipes, hand drums stretched over wooden frames. These were instruments within reach of almost anyone, and they appear in archaeological records across medieval Europe in quantities that confirm what the written sources also suggest. A lot of people were playing a lot of music a lot of the time. You did not need training to play a drum badly, and playing a drum badly was still better than the silence it replaced, which in a medieval winter evening context was a silence full of wind noise and the sound of something chewing through your thatch. The professional musicians, the minstrels who performed at noble courts, the musicians who accompanied important ceremonies, occupied a different world entirely. These were skilled performers who had trained for years, who understood music theory and the tradition passed down through monasteries and courts, and who could perform complex polyphonic compositions with multiple instruments moving in carefully coordinated patterns. The gap between the man hitting a drum in a village tavern and the trained consort performing for a duke was approximately the same as the gap between someone strumming 3 chords on an acoustic guitar at a backyard barbecue and a professional orchestra. Both are music. They are not the same music. Songs were how information moved and how feelings got processed. Work songs accompanied repetitive labour. The rhythm helped coordinate effort and made the hours pass. Love songs circulated through the population in the way that earworms always have, popping up in unexpected places, being adapted, rewritten, stolen, and improved by generations of singers who never gave the original composer any credit. Laments mourned losses that couldn't be articulated in plain speech. Drinking songs turned a normal evening into an event. The medieval world had a song for every emotional occasion and was not shy about using them. There was also a rich tradition of competitive musical performance, song contests, improvisation challenges, situations where performers would be given a theme and expected to compose and perform something immediately in front of an audience who were both judging and enjoying the results. This was especially prominent in southern France and northern Spain in the troubadour tradition, where the combination of musical skill, poetic craft, and performance confidence was considered a genuine aristocratic accomplishment, something a noble should be able to do and be proud of doing. The hurdy-gurdy, to return to it for a moment, deserves acknowledgement as one of the stranger instruments in the medieval toolkit. A stringed instrument played by turning a rosined wheel against the strings with one hand, while the other played a small keyboard. It droned. It wheezed slightly. It had a sound that contemporary descriptions suggest was both hypnotic and slightly unsettling, like something alive but uncertain what kind of alive it wanted to be. It was popular at dances because it could maintain a steady rhythm indefinitely. It was also, by all accounts, deeply satisfying to play badly in a way that the lute was not. The lute required precision. The hurdy-gurdy just required commitment, and medieval people had plenty of that. If you've ever watched someone at a party resist dancing for 45 minutes and then suddenly be impossible to get off the floor, you would have fit right in during the Middle Ages. Medieval people loved dancing with a commitment that was frankly impressive given everything else going on in their lives. Village dances called carols were not the stiff formal affairs of later centuries. They were circles of people holding hands, moving together, sometimes singing the accompaniment themselves, weaving through patterns in churchyards and town squares and fields. It was joyful, it was communal, and it was one of the few activities where the rules of medieval social hierarchy got slightly blurry. Because when the music started, the blacksmith's daughter and the baker's son were just two people in the same circle, moving to the same beat, and for a little while, that was enough. The carol was the simplest and most democratic form of medieval dance, a circle or a chain, people linked by hands or by touch, moving in patterns that range from simple walking steps to more complex figures that required genuine coordination. It required no training to participate in a basic form, which meant everyone could join in, and in the medieval spirit of doing things communally, everyone generally did. Contemporary illustrations show these dances happening in churchyards after services, in fields at festival time, in great hall clearings after the tables have been pushed aside, in streets during celebrations. The geography changed. The basic impulse remained identical. At the other end of the social scale, courtly dance was a different animal entirely. Formal, choreographed, studied, and performed in front of an audience that was absolutely paying attention to whether you were doing it correctly. Nobility and their households learned specific dances that signalled refinement, education, and the kind of bodily control that was considered a mark of a well-formed character. The estampe was an early court dance with a structured musical form and specific footwork patterns. The bass dance, popular from the 14th century onward, was slower, more stately, and conducted with the kind of dignified control that made it look easy while concealing the fact that it absolutely wasn't. Dancing happened at weddings above all else. A medieval wedding without dancing was barely a wedding. It was just a ceremony and a meal, which was fine but was missing the point. Wedding dances could go on for hours, sometimes for days in the most enthusiastic celebrations, and they served a social function beyond entertainment. They brought the two families together in a shared physical activity, mixed people who might not otherwise interact, and created collective memories of the occasion that the participants would carry for the rest of their lives. You remembered your cousin's wedding because of the dancing. Specifically, you remembered the moment when someone's father attempted something ambitious and achieved something spectacular. The church had opinions about dancing, as it had opinions about most things people enjoyed. Dancing in churchyards was technically prohibited and practically unstoppable, Mixed-sex dancing was viewed with theological suspicion on the grounds that bodies in proximity to other bodies could lead to thoughts that had no business being in anyone's head on a saint's day. Specific dances were condemned in sermons as leading to moral decline. Records survive of priests delivering thunderous warnings against the perils of the dance, and then, a few pages later in the same document, approving expenses for musicians hired for a feast. The medieval church, like most institutions throughout history, said one thing about fun and did another. What danced through all of this? The courtly formality, the village carol, the wedding chaos, the church's conflicted relationship with it. Wow, was something that didn't need justification and didn't really accept prohibition. People danced because it felt good, because it was done together, because music created an almost physical pressure to move, and because the alternative, standing still on the edge of a celebration while everyone else was in motion, was not something most human beings have ever been very good at. Medieval people were not different in this. They heard the music. They moved. And for the duration of it, the cold and the work and the aching joints and the rent due to the Lord were all, briefly, somewhere else. There is a very particular kind of person who, during a casual game of something, suddenly becomes aggressively competitive, forgets they are supposed to be having fun, and starts arguing about the rules. That person existed in the Middle Ages. They have always existed. They will always exist. Medieval board games included chess, already ancient and deeply serious by the 1300s, as well as tables, an ancestor of backgammon, and a variety of dice games that were technically frowned upon by the church and therefore played absolutely everywhere. Dice games especially carried a reputation for ruining lives, which only made them more popular. Chess in particular was the game of the educated and the elite, but also of anyone who wanted to seem educated and elite, which turned out to be a surprisingly large number of people. Chess arrived in Europe from the Islamic world, having travelled from India through Persia and into the courts of Muslim Spain and Sicily, carrying with it a reputation as a game of kings, generals, and strategic intelligence. In its original form, the pieces had different names and different abilities from the modern version. The piece we now call the Queen was originally a counsellor, and it moved far more weakly than its current all-powerful form. The medieval Queen piece gained her devastating range of movement around the 15th century, and the timing of this change, coinciding with a period when several extremely powerful European queens were reshaping the political landscape, has been noted by historians with a kind of dry satisfaction that comes from a good coincidence. By the 12th and 13th centuries, chess was everywhere in European noble culture. It appeared in romances and poems as a symbol of refined intellect. It was used as a metaphor for war, for love, for the relationship between social classes. Entire allegorical works were written using the chess pieces as characters representing different virtues and social roles. And underneath all of this cultural significance, people just really liked playing it. Carved chess sets in ivory, bone and stone survive in museum collections today. Some exquisite works of miniature sculpture, others clearly knocked together quickly from whatever was at hand by someone who needed the pieces immediately and wasn't going to wait for an artisan. Tables, the ancestor of backgammon, was arguably even more widespread than chess, because it combined strategy with the dice element that chess lacked, meaning that luck played a role and even a less skilled player could win on a good day. This made it more democratic, more exciting, and considerably more suitable for gambling, which meant it was considerably more controversial. The combination of skill and chance that tables provided was deeply appealing to a culture that understood that life operated on the same principles. You made your best moves and then the dice fell how they fell and you dealt with it. Morella's, known today as Nine Men's Morris, was another board game of genuine antiquity that appears carved into stone in medieval buildings, including in the cloisters of English cathedrals, which raises interesting questions about what monks were doing when they were supposed to be praying. It is a strategic game for two players involving placing and moving pieces to create lines of three. Simple to learn, and capable of generating the kind of slow-burning tension that ends friendships. The fact that it was carved into the stonework of serious religious buildings is either evidence that the carvers were bored during construction, or that the monks who came after them were playing during meditation hours. Possibly both. The competitive spirit that board games released was not always genteel. Records of arguments, accusations of cheating, overturned boards, and the specific kind of falling out that only a very close game can produce appear in medieval sources with enough regularity to confirm that the human capacity for taking recreational competition personally has not evolved at all in 700 years. Someone, somewhere in medieval Europe, dramatically accused their opponent of moving a piece when they weren't looking, was told they were imagining things, escalated the disagreement to a level wildly disproportionate to the occasion, and did not speak to that person for 3 weeks. It happened then. It happens now. The board games are different. The people are identical. Hunting in the modern imagination tends to fall into 2 categories: serious and practical, or deeply controversial. In the medieval world, it was neither of those things. It was theatre. For the nobility, hunting was an entire lifestyle, a passion that consumed enormous amounts of time, money, and effort, and produced an almost absurd infrastructure of trained dogs, trained falcons, specialist huntsmen, and written manuals about the correct way to pursue a stag. It was competitive, ritualized, and governed by rules so elaborate that getting them wrong was genuinely socially embarrassing. For the average peasant, hunting was technically illegal on most land. The forest belonged to the lord, and poaching a rabbit could mean serious punishment. But people did it anyway, quietly, at night, with traps and snares and the particular expression of someone who is definitely not doing anything wrong. The Great Noble Hunt was an event with an organisational complexity that would not embarrass a modern military operation. Huntsmen went out the previous day to locate the quarry and track its movements. The dogs, and there were many dogs, entire packs maintained at considerable expense, each trained for different roles, were prepared and managed by specialist kennelmen. Horses were selected and readied. The hunting party assembled in proper order and rode out with the kind of ceremonial weight that made it clear this was not a casual Tuesday morning activity. It was a performance of power and expertise, and everyone present understood they were participating in something that said something specific about who they were. Deer were the primary noble quarry, with the stag representing the highest form of chase, the animal that required the longest, most demanding pursuit, that tested horse and hound and hunter over hours of terrain, and whose killing followed a ritualized ceremony called the unmaking, in which the animal was butchered according to precise tradition, with specific parts allocated to specific participants in a hierarchy that mirrored the social order of the hunt itself. Getting the ceremony wrong, cutting in the wrong order, allocating the wrong parts, was a failure that knowledgeable observers would notice and remember. The hunt was not just about the killing. It was about doing the killing correctly. Boar hunting occupied a special category of dangerous prestige. Wild boar were genuinely, seriously dangerous animals, fast, powerful, and equipped with tusks capable of killing a horse. Hunting one on foot with a spear, which was considered the appropriate and brave method, was not a metaphor for courage. It was an actual test of it. Contemporary accounts of boar hunts that went wrong are detailed enough to make clear that participants understood the risk was real, and the prestige associated with a successful boar hunt was calibrated accordingly. For the peasant, the relationship with hunting was entirely different and entirely illegal in most circumstances. The forests of medieval Europe were aggressively managed as noble property, with game preserved for the lord's exclusive use under laws that prescribed severe penalties for poaching, and yet poaching happened constantly. Rabbits, deer, wildfowl, anything that could be caught quietly and eaten without witnesses. The practical calculus was simple: the risk of punishment against the reality of hunger, against the fact that the animal was right there, against the deeply human resentment of a rule that said a man couldn't eat the rabbit that lived in the field he himself had ploughed. Poaching wasn't just theft in the medieval imagination. It was, for many peasants, a form of quiet justice, conducted at night with improvised snares and followed the next morning by a very innocent expression, and absolutely no conversation about the subject. If hunting was medieval theatre, falconry was medieval opera. Training a bird of prey to hunt for you, to fly off your gloved wrist, spiral up into the sky, and then plummet back down onto a duck with pinpoint accuracy, required months of patient, painstaking work, a specialised vocabulary, specialist equipment, and a bird that could at any point simply decide it was done with the whole arrangement and fly away. Nobles were obsessed with it. Different species of falcon were associated with different social ranks, meaning that the type of bird on your arm was a status symbol as loaded as a coat of arms. A peregrine falcon was for a prince, a goshawk was for a yeoman, and if you showed up with a sparrowhawk, a bird theoretically reserved for the clergy, people noticed. It was, in the most medieval way possible, extremely petty. The process of training a falcon was called manning, and it required a level of patience that is frankly difficult to explain to anyone accustomed to results happening quickly. A newly acquired hawk was first kept awake through a process called waking. The falconer carrying the bird on his fist for days at a time without sleep, talking quietly to it, handling it constantly, until the bird's wild instinct to treat every human as a threat had been worn down into something approaching tolerance. This is not a metaphor. The falconer literally did not sleep. The bird was then gradually introduced to the hood, a small leather cap placed over the bird's head to block its sight and calm it, and trained to return to the fist for food, and then to fly to the fist from a distance, and then further, and then to fly free and return. All of this took months. Some birds never fully cooperated. The medieval falconer accepted this with a resignation that sounds, in the written accounts, like the specific exhausted patience of someone dealing with a very beautiful, very unreliable co-worker. The equipment required was substantial. The hood needed to be fitted precisely to the individual bird. Too tight, and it caused distress. Too loose, and it fell off at the worst moment. The jesses, leather straps attached to the bird's legs, needed to be supple and strong without rubbing. The glove needed to be thick enough to protect the hand from talons that could pierce leather, and did so when the bird was irritated, which was often. Bells were attached to the bird's legs so it could be located when it disappeared into undergrowth or flew out of sight. Small brass bells whose ringing was the falconer's only signal, in a landscape without GPS or any other locating technology. Losing a trained hawk was a serious financial and emotional loss, and it happened all the time. The actual hunting, when everything worked, was extraordinary. A falcon stooping on prey from height, folding its wings and dropping at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour, is one of the most visually spectacular things a bird can do, and medieval observers knew it. It drew crowds. It generated conversation. It was one of the things that people who had seen it described to people who hadn't in tones that made the listener genuinely wish they had been there. The impact of falcon on prey was fast, efficient, and violent enough that contemporary writers sometimes struggled to find the right register, somewhere between admiration and awe, and the faintest suggestion that they were not entirely sure they deserved to witness something that capable. Falconry manuals, detailed, technical, and written with the seriousness of engineering documents, circulated among the nobility from at least the 9th century onward. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II wrote a treatise on falconry in the 13th century that is still respected by ornithologists today for the accuracy of its bird behaviour observations. Frederick was reportedly more enthusiastic about his falcons than about many of his political responsibilities, which his enemies noted and his falconers presumably found gratifying. In the medieval calculus of leisure, falconry was the activity that combined beauty, skill, patience, expense, and the constant possibility of complete failure most perfectly, which is perhaps why so many intelligent people were so thoroughly consumed by it. Long before anyone invented organised athletics with scoreboards and sponsorship deals, there was the medieval village sports day, informal, rowdy, and governed primarily by whatever the participants agreed on 5 minutes before things started. Wrestling was one of the oldest and most popular physical competitions, practiced across every social class, with an enthusiasm that suggests medieval people were genuinely hungry for the kind of activity that involved grabbing another person and trying to put them on the ground. Foot races were common at festivals. Stone throwing, similar to shot put but with whatever heavy rock was available, tested raw strength. And various forms of stick fighting and sword practice blurred the line between sport and actually useful skill. These events drew crowds, generated betting, and produced the particular village atmosphere where everyone knows everyone and everyone has opinions about the outcome. Wrestling in the medieval world had regional styles with specific rules. Cornwall had its own form, Brittany had its own form, Iceland had a version called gloomy that survives to this day as a traditional sport, but the underlying principle was universal. You grabbed your opponent, you used strength and technique and timing to unbalance them, and you put them on the ground. Throws, trips and holds were all part of the repertoire, and the best wrestlers were genuinely celebrated within their communities in the way that local sports heroes always are. The man who could beat everyone at the village wrestling match on the feast day had a social capital that didn't require wealth or title to be real and felt. He was the one everyone pointed out when he walked through the market. It mattered. Foot races ran the spectrum from simple sprints between two willing participants who had possibly made a bet to organise festival races with a small prize, an audience, and the accumulated investment of everyone who had an opinion about who was going to win. Medieval people were built for walking, not running. Their daily lives involved enormous amounts of sustained physical activity, of the slow, grinding agricultural kind, not the explosive short-burst kind, which meant that the genuinely fast runner was an unusual and remarkable person who was going to be asked to demonstrate this at every possible opportunity for the rest of his life. You did not quietly have a gift for running in a medieval village. Someone always found out. Hammer throwing, stone putting, and various forms of weight-heaving competitions appeared at fairs and festivals across the medieval world and required nothing more sophisticated than a large heavy object and the willingness to throw it as far as possible, which as premises for athletic competition go is among the most enduring ever devised. Variants of these events appear in records from Scotland to Germany to the Islamic world and everywhere else. Human beings have apparently looked at a heavy thing and thought, I wonder how far I can throw that. The answer was always, further than you, followed by, no, I can throw it further, and then a brief negotiation about the rules, and then an afternoon. Shinty in Scotland, hurling in Ireland, stickball in various forms across the continent. These rough team games involving sticks, balls and variable amounts of contact were enormously popular and occasionally catastrophic. Village teams played neighbouring village teams with a competitive intensity that reflected the fact that in a world without major league sports and long-distance communication, your village's honour was actually at stake in a way that feels disproportionate until you remember there was nothing else to measure it against. Contemporary records mention injuries. Occasionally they mention fatalities. The games continued. Rules were adjusted slightly and then, over time, quietly ignored again. The medieval approach to sports regulation was essentially, this is fine until it very obviously isn't, and then we try again. What united all of this? The wrestling, the races, the stone throwing, the chaotic stick games, was the quality of live spectacle. Medieval people understood that watching someone attempt something physically difficult in real time, in front of an audience that was emotionally invested in the outcome, was one of the fundamental forms of human entertainment. No production budget was required, no stadium, just a field, a crowd, and the specific electricity of something that might go anyway. Medieval people did not, contrary to what you might assume, spend all their free time inside avoiding nature. They engaged with the natural world in the way people do when it's simply the landscape of their existence rather than somewhere they commute through on the way to somewhere else. Swimming in rivers and ponds was common in summer. Not laps in a pool, not anything structured, just the joyful act of getting in the water on a hot day and floating around. In winter, frozen ponds and rivers became something entirely different. Skating surfaces, improvised with bone skates strapped to leather shoes, where medieval people glided around with varying degrees of grace and control. Contemporary accounts describe people whipping across the ice with poles for speed, crashing into each other, and in at least one well-documented case, a Londoner crashing so hard into a stone post that the results were not survivable. Medieval skating, deeply fun and occasionally fatal. Swimming in the Middle Ages occupied an interesting social space. It was practical. Medieval people crossed rivers, worked near water, and lived in landscapes where water was a constant presence. But it was also genuinely recreational. Monastic writers occasionally noted with mild disapproval that monks were fond of swimming in warm weather, which means monks were absolutely sneaking off to swim in warm weather, and someone had to write it down as a complaint. Children swam wherever water was accessible. Young men swam competitively, racing across rivers and ponds with the particular bravado of youth in any century. The idea that medieval people were universally terrified of water and avoided immersion at all costs is a myth sustained largely by the facts about their bathing habits, which were indeed minimal, but which is a separate category from recreational water activity entirely. The bone skates that medieval people used were made from the leg bones of horses, cattle, and other large animals, flattened on one side, smoothed and strapped to the bottom of leather shoes with cords. They did not have a sharp metal blade like modern skates, which means they did not cut into the ice and grip it. Instead, they glided across the surface with a frictionlessness that was genuinely fast and genuinely difficult to control. Medieval skaters propelled themselves with long poles, pushing off the ice like punting a boat, and steered by subtle shifts of weight and the kind of instinctive physical understanding that comes from doing something a lot in the absence of any other option. The 12th century writer William Fitzstephen, describing London's amusements in winter, wrote a passage about skating on the frozen marshes outside the city that is among the most vivid pieces of medieval leisure writing that survives. He describes young men fitting bones to their feet and propelling themselves forward with poles, gaining speeds that clearly impressed him, crashing into each other and into walls and into anyone unfortunate enough to be in the way, and generally conducting themselves with a specific mixture of joy and poor judgment that has characterized young people on ice in every era. The stone post incident he records, a skater hitting it at speed and suffering a broken leg or worse, is described without particular alarm as one of the expected costs of the activity. Medieval risk assessment was calibrated differently. Summer in rivers had its own character. Fishing was both practical and recreational. The patience required, the quiet of sitting by water, the combination of skill and luck that determined the outcome, gave it a meditative quality that medieval writers occasionally recognised explicitly. The river itself was a social space in warm weather. People gathered near it, children played in the shallows, and the specific pleasure of being near moving water on a hot day required no justification and no elaboration then any more than it does now. What all of this outdoor physical play shared was the quality of being free to do, free to participate in, requiring nothing beyond the body you had and the water or the ice or the field in front of you. In a world where entertainment was either communal and organised or required money or specialised equipment, the simple act of going to the river and getting in, or waiting for the pond to freeze and strapping bones to your feet and seeing how fast you could go, was available to almost everyone. And people took it, enthusiastically, every season it was on offer. Every civilization has had performers, people who figured out that other people would pay, or at least feed, someone willing to stand in a public place and do something that seemed impossible. Medieval Europe had travelling entertainers who wandered from town to town, village to village, setting up in market squares and feast hall entrances and performing a genuinely impressive range of physical acts. Juggling, tumbling, tightrope walking, contortion, fire eating, yes, fire eating, which apparently required no formal certification, and which people found as mesmerising then as they do now. These performers occupied a strange social position. They were welcomed enthusiastically on performance day, and viewed with deep suspicion the rest of the time, because someone who travelled alone, appeared without warning, and did things that seemed physically improbable was not entirely trusted by the average medieval village. But they kept coming back because the act was too good to miss. The juggler, called a jongleur in French, a term that covered everyone from acrobats to musicians to storytellers, in a wonderfully imprecise catch-all, was the most visible kind of travelling entertainer, and also the most versatile. A good jongleur didn't do one thing. He did everything. Juggled, told jokes, performed short comic scenes, played an instrument badly or well depending on what the crowd wanted, and adapted his act in real time to whatever was working. The word itself comes from the same root as the English word juggler, but the medieval version had a much broader job description. If it entertained a crowd and kept them willing to throw coins, it was part of the act. If it stopped working, you tried something else. The medieval entertainer had no safety net in either the literal or the professional sense of the phrase. Tightrope walking drew the largest crowds of any street performance, for reasons that don't require much explanation. Watching a person balance on a rope high above the ground activates something very old and very attentive in human consciousness. Medieval tightrope walkers performed in market squares, at fairs, and at noble entertainments, sometimes incorporating other skills into the act, juggling while balanced, performing acrobatic movements, occasionally incorporating a partner. The ropes themselves were strung between buildings or poles at heights that range from mildly alarming to genuinely dangerous, and contemporary illustrations show audiences packed tightly below, heads tilted up, with the expressions of people who are genuinely uncertain whether this is going to end well and can't look away for that precise reason. Contortionists and acrobats, tumblers in the medieval vocabulary, perform the kind of physical feats that require years of training beginning in childhood, and a relationship with your own body's capabilities that most people never develop. Handstands, backflips, human pyramids, feats of strength and flexibility that looked effortless, and were anything but. These were practiced skills, passed down through families of performers or learned in the loose apprenticeship system that governed most craft knowledge in the medieval world. A family of tumblers travelling together was not unusual. Parents, children, possibly cousins, all contributing different skills to a combined act that could fill an evening's entertainment at a noble feast or an afternoon's crowd at a market. Fire eating and fire manipulation occupied the extreme end of the performance spectrum, not because fire was uniquely dangerous in a world where everyone cooked over open flames and heated their homes with burning wood, but because the deliberate, controlled use of fire as a performance element required a specific kind of nerve that audiences clearly found compelling across all social levels. Written accounts of fire performers appear in records from noble courts and popular fairs alike, suggesting this was not a niche act but a broadly appealing one. The social ambiguity of these performers was real and consistently documented. They moved between communities without belonging to any of them. They were outside the guild system, outside the parish structure, outside the networks of obligation and mutual accountability that held medieval social life together. This made them simultaneously freer than most people and more vulnerable, free to travel, to perform, to live outside the ordinary rules, but without the protections those rules also provided. When times were hard, they moved on. When a performance went badly, there was no institution behind them. They were entirely on their own, which was either exciting or terrifying depending on the day. And yet, at the moment of performance, in the silence before the first torch was lit, in the held breath of an audience watching something that their rational minds knew was a skill and their bodies couldn't entirely believe, they were the most important person in any room they occupied. That specific power, brief and renewable and entirely dependent on the next performance, was its own reward. Medieval entertainers understood this with a clarity that suggests they had thought about it, and they kept moving. The medieval church had very strong opinions about gambling. It was sinful, it was wasteful, it encouraged greed, ruined families, and led otherwise decent people down a path that ended badly. The church said all of this loudly, clearly, and repeatedly, with genuine conviction. Medieval people said, yes, absolutely, and then went back to their dice. Gambling was everywhere, in taverns, at festivals, at tournaments, in the street, in private homes, and allegedly in the vicinity of more than a few monasteries when the abbot wasn't looking. Dice were the main instrument, small enough to pocket and fast enough to play between other activities. But people bet on everything. Cockfights, wrestling bouts, card games once cards arrived from the Islamic world in the 14th century, and the outcomes of contests that sometimes seemed invented purely to have something to wager on. The combination of boredom, communal gathering, and small amounts of money is apparently eternal and universal. Dice in the medieval world were made from bone, ivory, lead, stone, and wood, and they were not always honest. Loaded dice, weighted to favour certain faces, appear in medieval records both as objects of complaint and as objects confiscated from people caught cheating, which confirms two things: that cheating at dice was common enough to have developed its own technology, and that the cheating was detected often enough to be worth complaining about officially. Medieval dice cheats and modern card counters are separated by 700 years and entirely identical motivations. The house edge was unacceptable, the temptation to tilt the odds was irresistible, and the social consequences of getting caught were severe enough to be a deterrent that clearly did not deter. The games played with dice ranged from pure chance, throw and compare totals, highest wins, to games that combined dice rolls with decisions, where skill interacted with luck in the way that made losing feel almost winnable and winning feel almost inevitable. Hazard was one of the most popular dice games in medieval England, a game of enough complexity that it generated its own vocabulary of terms that survive in the word hazard itself, now meaning risk or danger rather than a specific game, which tells you something about its reputation. You played hazard at the table next to someone who had been playing for 3 hours and whose expression had progressed through cheerful, concentrated, quietly desperate, and was now somewhere in the vicinity of committed beyond reason. Card games arrived in Europe from the Islamic world in the late 14th century and spread with a speed that suggests the population had been waiting for them without knowing it. Cards introduced new dimensions of strategy and deception, the hidden hand, the bluff, the ability to conceal information from opponents in ways that dice games didn't permit. They were immediately controversial, immediately popular, and immediately incorporated into gambling culture, with no meaningful gap between their introduction and the first documented complaint about them. Playing cards were condemned in municipal regulations in several European cities within decades of their arrival, which is the medieval equivalent of something going viral. Betting on animal contests, cockfighting especially, but also bear baiting and various other arrangements that the modern world views very differently, was both entertainment and gambling simultaneously, combining the spectacle of the contest with the financial investment of having money on the outcome. The emotional engagement this produced was, by contemporary accounts, intense. People who had bet on the wrong bird were not philosophical about it. Losses produced the specific misery of money gone and pride wounded simultaneously, a combination that has never been easy for anyone to absorb gracefully. What the Church's repeated condemnations of gambling reveal, more than anything else, is how completely they failed. Every prohibition, every sermon, every municipal regulation produced the same result. People acknowledged the concern, agreed in principle, and went back to their dice as soon as the authority figure had moved on. Medieval people were not uniquely virtuous. They were not uniquely sinful. They were people, with the same relationship to small-scale financial risk and the thrill of uncertain outcomes that people have always had, doing what people have always done when told they shouldn't. Here is a thing that gets lost when people think about the Middle Ages. They had theatre, real theatre, scripted, rehearsed, costumed, performed for an audience theatre that drew crowds and generated genuine excitement, and which tackled, of all things, the entire Bible in dramatic form. Mystery plays, performed in cycles, organised by trade guilds, mounted on elaborate wagons that rolled through town or erected on stages in public squares, dramatised the stories of scripture in language that was sometimes solemn, often surprisingly funny, and occasionally so bizarre in its staging that you genuinely wonder what the director was thinking. God appeared on stage, the devil appeared on stage, usually as a comic villain who got laughed at. Jesus was crucified in front of a live crowd, and somewhere in the middle of all this sacred drama there were jokes. Good jokes, apparently, because people kept coming back. The mystery play cycle was a civic event on a scale that most medieval communities experienced only a handful of times in a year. In cities like York, Chester and Wakefield in England, the full cycle involved dozens of individual plays performed sequentially on wagon stages that moved through the streets, so that the audience stood in one place and the performance came to them. A parade of biblical episodes from creation through the Last Judgment, each mounted by a different guild. The guilds took their assignments seriously and competitively. The York shipwrights performed Noah's Ark. The bakers performed the Last Supper. The goldsmiths performed the arrival of the Magi. Whether these pairings were deliberately ironic or entirely practical has been debated by scholars for decades. The answer is almost certainly both. The staging was elaborate by any measure, and the medieval theatrical imagination was not timid. Heaven was represented by a raised platform with appropriate visual splendour. Hell was represented by a dramatically constructed mouth, the Hell Mouth, a terrifying theatrical device built to look like a giant demonic face with a gaping jaw from which flames emerged and into which damned souls were dramatically dragged. Contemporary records indicate that the Hellmouth was one of the most popular features of the entire cycle, which says something clear and recognisable about audience preferences in any century. The devil was consistently played for comedy, a figure of noise, chaos and spectacular failure whose attempts to corrupt souls were regularly and humiliatingly defeated. Medieval audiences loved this. They laughed loudly and repeatedly at a figure they were simultaneously supposed to fear. Religious and comic were not opposites in the medieval theatrical imagination. The scripts that survive are extraordinary documents, vernacular English at a stage of the language that still sounds strange to modern ears, but contains moments of genuine dramatic power alongside jokes that still work. The Wakefield master, the anonymous playwright responsible for some of the Townley cycle plays, wrote comedy that was sharp, specific, and deeply aware of class dynamics. His shepherd characters, complaining about grasping landlords and bad weather and the general difficulty of getting through the day, sound remarkably contemporary. He also wrote sacred drama of real emotional weight. That both existed in the same body of work, sometimes in the same play, is a feature of medieval theatrical culture, rather than an inconsistency in it. The actors were not professionals in the modern sense. They were guild members, craftsmen, merchants, tradespeople, who took on the responsibility of performing as part of their civic and religious duty, rehearsed under the direction of whoever in the guild had the organisational capacity to manage the chaos, and performed in public view of their entire community. The stakes of a bad performance were real. Your guild's reputation, your personal standing, and the fact that everyone watching you had known you for 30 years and would be entirely willing to mention this later. The pressure produced, by all accounts, genuine commitment. People took their angel costumes seriously. People took their devil costumes perhaps a little too seriously. The results were apparently worth watching. There is something deeply human about the desire to leave where you are, go somewhere meaningful, and come back changed. Pilgrimage in the medieval world was that impulse taken seriously and turned into an entire cultural institution. People left their villages and towns and walked, sometimes hundreds of miles, to visit the shrines of saints, seeking healing, seeking forgiveness, seeking something harder to name. The most ambitious pilgrims walked to Rome or Jerusalem. More manageable journeys went to Canterbury, Compostela, or any of dozens of local shrines scattered across the landscape. And here is the part the history books underplay. Pilgrimage was also fun. It was travel in a world where most people rarely left their home parish. It meant new roads, new people, shared meals with strangers, songs sung walking, stories exchanged at inns. Geoffrey Chaucer saw this clearly enough to write an entire masterpiece about it. The decision to go on pilgrimage required preparation that was both practical and ceremonial. You obtained permission from your lord, from your family, from the church, and you arranged your affairs in the knowledge that you might be gone for weeks, months, or, for the most ambitious journeys, over a year. You acquired the specific equipment of the pilgrim, the staff, the scrip, a small bag, and if you could afford it, a hat with a wide brim suitable for long days walking in variable weather. You received a blessing at your local church, a formal send-off that marked your departure as something significant rather than just a long walk, and then you left. For most medieval people, walking out of the parish and continuing to walk was an experience without precedent. The road itself was populated with other pilgrims, which was most of the point. The social world of pilgrimage was its own temporary community, people thrown together by shared destination and shared experience, with the particular openness that travel produces in people who have stepped outside their normal identities. A merchant walking next to a ploughman, next to a widow, next to a minor noble was not a social configuration that the medieval world produced easily in any other context. Pilgrimage scrambled the usual order slightly, not enough to threaten it, but enough to permit conversations and connections that the home village would never have generated. You talked to strangers. You heard their stories. You told yours. By the time you arrived, you knew people you would never have known otherwise, and some of them you kept. The shrines themselves were theatrical experiences, carefully designed environments intended to produce specific emotional and spiritual states in the visitors who arrived after days or weeks of walking. The approach was managed deliberately, routes that took you past secondary sacred sites, building expectation, crowds that confirmed you were part of something larger than yourself. The shrine itself glimpsed after a final approach that made the arrival feel like culmination. The relics were real in the most important sense. The belief in them was entirely real. The reports of healings and miracles were experienced as real, and the emotional response of pilgrims who reached the tomb of a beloved saint after a long journey was genuine and overwhelming regardless of what was or wasn't actually in the reliquary. Coming home was its own kind of transformation. You brought back a pilgrim's badge, a small lead or pewter token sold at the shrine, proof of your journey, worn on your hat or cloak. You brought back stories. You brought back a changed quality of attention, the specific alertness of someone who has been somewhere and returned, who has seen roads and towns and people and landscapes that the people around them have only heard described. In a world of very small radii, the returned pilgrim carried something that could not quite be named and was impossible to fully share. The knowledge of a larger world, acquired the hard way, one step at a time. Imagine a county fair. Now remove the electricity, the cotton candy, and the safety regulations. Add animal trading, travelling merchants selling goods from 3 countries away, performers of varying skill and legality, gambling dens operating openly in tents, enormous quantities of ale, a genuine sense that anything might happen, and a crowd of people who have been waiting months for this specific day. That is a medieval fair, and it was extraordinary. Fairs happened on the feast days of saints, usually once or twice a year, and they were simultaneously market, entertainment venue, social event, and something slightly dangerous. Merchants travelled long distances to set up stalls. Acrobats worked the crowd. Animals were bought and sold with a particular theatrical drama of people who believed negotiating is a full contact sport. And ordinary people who spent most of the year in the same small radius of home suddenly found themselves in the middle of something that felt like the whole world arriving at once. The great fairs of medieval Europe were serious economic engines as well as entertainment events, and the two functions were completely inseparable. The Champagne fairs in France, held at rotating locations through the year, were among the most important trading events in Europe. International merchants bringing silk, spices, wool, leather, and metalwork from across the known world, conducting transactions that moved enormous amounts of money through a system of credit and exchange that was more sophisticated than the popular image of medieval commerce allows. These were not purely local events. The goods on sale came from further away than most of the buyers had ever travelled, and that geographical distance was part of the appeal. The fair was where the world came to you, compressed into a field for a week. At the local level, fairs were smaller, and their economic function was more immediately practical. Animals traded, tools purchased, goods that couldn't be made or grown locally acquired in the brief window of the fair's duration. But even at this scale, the social electricity was real. The fair meant strangers. It meant news from elsewhere. It meant the kind of crowd that created its own permissions. The anonymity of a large gathering where you were not necessarily known, where you could watch something you might not admit to watching, buy something you might not admit to buying, talk to someone you would not normally approach. Pickpockets understood this perfectly and worked the fair crowds with professional skill. Medieval fair-going included the specific anxiety of guarding your purse in a dense crowd, an anxiety so consistent and well documented that it produced its own vocabulary, its own warnings, its own advice literature about how not to have your money taken in a crowd. The thief at the fair was as much a fixture as the merchant selling cloth. Both were specialists in the social dynamics of large temporary gatherings, working the same crowd from opposite directions. The entertainment at fairs ranged from the impressive to the entirely fraudulent. Genuine performers shared the ground with sellers of miracle cures, individuals claiming to have unusual animals or extraordinary abilities, games that were rigged so reliably that the only people who didn't know were the people who had never played them before, and an entire ecosystem of minor commerce and petty dishonesty that the medieval fair licensed simply by creating the conditions in which it could flourish. People were cheated. People expected to be somewhat cheated. The trick was to enjoy everything else enough to consider it worth it. Most did. The fair came once a year. You went, you spent, you were probably cheated a little. You had an extraordinary time, and you came home with a story. This was the deal, and everyone knew it. Before the calendar was a rectangle on the wall with dentist appointments and birthday reminders, it was a rhythm, a cycle of seasons, saints' days, and festivals that gave medieval life a structure and emotional shape that the daily grind alone couldn't provide. May Day was one of the most beloved, a celebration of spring arriving that involved garlands of flowers, dancing around a maypole, crowning a May Queen, and a general loosening of the rules that governed behaviour the other 364 days of the year. Midsummer brought bonfires lit on hilltops, visible for miles, where communities gathered around the flames and did things that the church was never entirely comfortable with, but tolerated on the grounds that you couldn't stop everyone from celebrating, that the days were long. These festivals were anchors, collective experiences that made the year feel like something more than a sequence of laborious weeks. May Day began before dawn, which sounds like a significant commitment and was. The tradition of going out into the fields and woods at first light on the 1st of May to gather flowers, branches and greenery, called bringing in the May, was taken seriously enough that people genuinely set alarms for it in the only way medieval people set alarms, which was by telling themselves firmly to wake up and apparently trusting this instruction. The greenery brought back was used to decorate homes, doors, and the maypole itself, a tall wooden pole set up in the village centre around which the dancing happened in complex woven patterns involving ribbons and coordination that required more rehearsal than the spontaneous joy of it suggests. The May Queen was selected from among the young women of the village, crowned with flowers, and presided over the festivities with a ceremonial weight that made her briefly, genuinely significant in a world that offered women very few such moments. The church had a complicated relationship with May Day that could be summarised as, "We cannot stop this. We have tried to stop this. We're going to keep trying to stop this while also accepting that it is happening." The pre-Christian roots of the Spring Festival were never entirely buried under the Christian calendar, and medieval clergy were aware of this, and variously alarmed by it, resigned to it, and occasionally, in the cases of the more pragmatic, participating in it. The flowers were real, the joy was real, the theological objections were also real. All three coexisted with the cheerful disregard for consistency that characterises most lived religious practice. Midsummer was different in character. Where May Day was about colour and movement and woven ribbons and flowers, Midsummer was about fire. Bonfires lit on the eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist, on the 23rd of June, blazed across the medieval landscape in a chain of light that connected communities across distances. People jumped over the fires, which was apparently both a spiritual practice and a competitive activity depending on how much ale had been consumed. Herbs gathered at midsummer were believed to have special properties, the year's most powerful magical window. Bonfires were supposed to drive away evil spirits. They were also, practically, simply spectacular. Something beautiful and large and dangerous in a world where most things were small and dark. Harvest festivals closed the cycle in autumn, when the last sheaf of grain was cut with ceremony, and the communal labour of the harvest season was marked with collective celebration. The relief of a good harvest was not abstract. It was the difference between a village that would eat through winter and one that wouldn't. The celebration that followed a successful harvest had a quality of genuine gratitude underneath the festivity. People drinking and singing and eating with the knowledge that they had made it, that the year's gamble had paid off, that the ground had given back what they had put into it. That feeling does not need to be performed. In the medieval world, it was simply true. Medieval childhood was not easy, and everyone agrees on that. But between the chores and the early responsibilities and the general precariousness of surviving the first decade of life, medieval children played. They played with enthusiasm, creativity, and a complete willingness to play with literally anything that could be turned into a toy, which included sticks, pebbles, scraps of cloth, wooden figures carved by a patient parent, spinning tops, hoops rolled through the street, and each other. Games of tag and hide-and-seek under various names appear in medieval sources with enough regularity to confirm that children have always wanted to chase each other around and hide behind things while adults pretend not to notice. Blindfold games were popular. Ball games played in streets and fields generated the kind of chaos that probably annoyed the neighbours in any century. Medieval children were fundamentally still children, and they made the most of it. Archaeological excavations of medieval sites have produced a reliable category of small finds that archaeologists classify diplomatically as toys: miniature pottery vessels too small to be functional, small carved animals, lead figurines of knights and horses, clay balls, bone and wooden tops. These objects were made by adults for children, or by children for themselves from whatever materials were at hand, and their existence confirms what the written record also suggests, that medieval adults understood children needed to play and provided for it, in the same pragmatic spirit in which they provided for everything else. A wooden toy horse didn't require commentary or justification. The child wanted it. Someone made it. The child played with it until it broke. This is universal and has never required explanation. Hoops were among the most universally documented children's toys in the medieval world, appearing in illustrations, mentioned in written sources, and found archaeologically in forms ranging from salvaged barrel hoops to purpose-made wooden rings. The game was exactly what it appears to be. You roll it and chase it and keep it rolling as long as possible, which requires more skill than it sounds and produced, by all accounts, competitive intensity disproportionate to the apparent simplicity of the activity. A hoop and a stick to guide it could occupy a child for an entire afternoon, and require nothing else. No opponent, no organisation, no adult supervision, just the rolling thing and the need to keep it moving. The medieval child with a hoop was doing precisely what the modern child with a scooter is doing, just quieter and with wood. Ball games in the street were documented primarily through the complaints they generated. Balls breaking windows, balls knocking over market stalls, balls hitting people who had not consented to be part of the game and were not philosophical about it. These complaints appear in municipal records across medieval Europe with an inevitability that suggests the balls were always in the street and the complaints were always being filed and nothing changed. Children kicked leather balls stuffed with rags or straw through open spaces with the same territorial joy that produces modern pick-up soccer games, adapting rules to available space and available players, and arguing about outcomes with a conviction that the rules agreed upon 3 minutes ago supported their position entirely. Marbles, small clay or stone spheres, were flicked and rolled with the serious competitive investment that small-scale games always seem to generate in children, who understand instinctively that the stakes of a marble match are much higher than they appear. Spinning tops were whipped into motion and left to spiral across whatever flat surface was available. Knuckle bones, small ankle bones from sheep, used for a game that combined tossing and catching in complex patterns, appear in children's contexts across the medieval world and in fact across most of human history. The game requires 4 small bones, a flat surface, and the willingness to spend several afternoons mastering the harder throws. Medieval children had all 3. What strikes you, looking at the full picture of medieval children's play, is how recognisable it is. The specific toys change, the specific games carry different names, but the activity, the improvised, energetic, rule-inventing, argument-generating, utterly committed physical play of children, in a world they are still learning to understand, is identical. Medieval children were not small adults waiting sadly to grow up. They were children, doing what children have always done, turning the available world into a game and playing it as hard as they could. This is going to sound controversial, but bear with it. For a significant portion of medieval people, church was one of the most musically stimulating experiences of their week. Not in a casual background noise sense, in a this is genuinely extraordinary sense. Medieval liturgical music, plainchant, polyphony, antiphonal singing where different groups of voices responded to each other across the space of a cathedral, was composed and performed with a seriousness and sophistication that produced sounds these churches were literally built to amplify. Stone walls and vaulted ceilings that could make a single voice bloom into something that filled every corner of a vast space. For people who had no concert halls, no recordings, no amplification of any kind, the experience of hearing a skilled choir in a great cathedral was, by multiple accounts, genuinely overwhelming. People wept. People stood motionless. People described it in terms that suggested they were not entirely sure it was of this world. Gregorian chant, the monophonic plainchant that formed the core of the Roman Catholic liturgy, is difficult to evaluate fairly through modern ears because we hear it in specific contexts, recordings, films, meditative settings. The medieval experience was different and more immediate. You heard it in the building it was made for, with the specific acoustic properties of stone vaulting, creating resonances that extended each note into something beyond the singer, filling the architecture with sound in a way that felt, and was clearly intended to feel, supernatural. The chant was not decorated, not harmonized, not accompanied by instruments in its pure form. It was one line of melody, moving through a space designed to multiply it. The effect on an unprepared listener walking into a cathedral mid-office was, by contemporary accounts, destabilizing in the best possible sense. Polyphony, multiple independent melodic lines sung simultaneously, developed through the medieval period from early two-voice organum into the elaborate interlocking structures of the 13th and 14th centuries, where 3 or 4 voices move through a composition in patterns of rhythmic and melodic independence that shouldn't have worked and did. The Notre Dame School of Composition in Paris in the 12th and 13th centuries produced music of a complexity that still challenges skilled singers today. The composers, figures like Léonin and Perrotin, were celebrated in their time in the specific way that genuinely great technical innovators are celebrated, with admiration, with confusion, and with the occasional complaint from the theologically conservative that this level of musical sophistication was somehow inappropriate for worship, which is a complaint that has been made about sacred music in essentially every century. Parish churches offered a more modest, but no less sincere version of this. The local choir, made up of villagers with varying degrees of musical training, sang the liturgy in a smaller space for a smaller congregation, and the quality of what they produced was not always consistent. Medieval sources contain both praise for moving choral performances and complaints about singers who were off-pitch, ill-prepared, or distracted. The choir in the average parish church was doing its best with variable resources, which is to say it was exactly like most community choirs in any era, with the specific pressure of performing in a context where the work was considered sacred and the audience included God. Sacred music wasn't confined to the liturgy. Carols, originally not specifically Christmas songs but round dances with sung accompaniment, circulated through the population in forms that mixed religious and secular content in proportions that varied widely. Processional hymns for feast days, songs for specific saints, vernacular devotional poetry set to simple melodies that could be learned by communities without musical training. All of this constituted a musical culture that extended from the most sophisticated cathedral polyphony to a congregation singing a simple refrain together, and the entire range was available to medieval people in a way that required nothing more than being present. You didn't need a ticket. You didn't need a device. You just needed to be there when the singing started, and the architecture did the rest. When you're thinking about medieval romance, the image that probably floats up is some variation of a knight writing a poem to a noblewoman he can never have, or a peasant couple exchanging a shy glance over a barrel of turnips. The reality was more varied, more human, and honestly more recognisable than either of those. People fell in love in the Middle Ages with the same inconvenient, consuming intensity they always have. They wrote poems, not everyone, and not well, but they wrote them. They sang songs to each other. They gave small gifts, flowers, ribbons, tokens. They found excuses to be in the same place at the same time, and then looked away when it was noticed. Love was complicated by the fact that marriage was primarily a social and economic arrangement rather than a romantic one, which meant that actual romantic feeling was a kind of excess, a luxury that happened alongside or in spite of the official arrangements and which people pursued with considerable ingenuity. The courtly love tradition, amour courtois in the French in which it was largely codified, was an elaborate cultural fiction and a genuine emotional reality simultaneously. At the level of literary convention, it described a highly formalized relationship between a devoted knight and an idealized, often unattainable lady, governed by rules of service and restraint that elevated love into something closer to religious devotion. Poets and troubadours composed elaborate verses in this mode across the 12th and 13th centuries, and the convention spread from southern France across Europe with a speed that suggests they were meeting an existing appetite for romantic language rather than creating it. Real people used the vocabulary of courtly love to describe real feelings, in the way that people in any era use the cultural scripts available to them to articulate experiences that resist plain language. At the village level, the courtship rituals were less literary but no less genuine. Festivals, particularly May Day and Midsummer, were explicitly understood to be occasions when young people paired off, and the degree of parental tolerance for this ranged from active encouragement to resigned acceptance to the kind of theoretical disapproval that was never quite followed up with actual intervention. Medieval matchmaking was often semi-formal. families of similar standing whose children spent time together, with the understanding that the proximity was not accidental. Young men found reasons to walk past the houses of young women they were interested in. Young women found reasons to be visible at the moments when this was happening. The specific dance of mutual pretended indifference followed by unmistakable signals was not invented in the 21st century. Gifts in medieval courtship were small and symbolic: a ring, a brooch, a ribbon, a flower. The exchange of tokens was a recognized language, its meaning understood by everyone in the community while technically plausibly deniable to anyone who needed it to be. A man who gave a woman a ring was saying something specific. Whether that something became official depended on negotiations that involved the families as much as the individuals, but the feeling behind the gesture was personal, private, and real. Medieval betrothal was a serious legal commitment, often nearly as binding as marriage itself, and the process of arriving at it involved both negotiation and genuine individual consent. Church law required that both parties agree freely, which was not always honoured in practice but was at least the official standard. Love letters survive from medieval England in the Paston family correspondence. Real letters written by real people navigating the intersection of genuine feeling and social necessity, worrying about whether their attachment would be approved, missing each other, writing with a warmth that closes 700 years of distance entirely. They were not writing to history. They were writing to a specific person, about a specific situation and feeling, in the same uncertain hope that the feeling would be understood and returned. It was, mostly. The Pastons were a complicated family, but the letters are extraordinary, and what they reveal most clearly is that the medieval heart was recognisable in every important way, doing exactly what hearts have always done in the face of another person, who seemed, for reasons not entirely logical, essential. If you want to understand how information moved through a medieval community, forget the church bulletin and the town crier. The real mechanism was gossip, and it was ferociously efficient. In a world where most people lived in small, tightly interconnected communities where everyone knew everyone, and everyone's business was technically everyone else's business, the social monitoring function that gossip serves was not a minor background activity. It was the primary way reputations were built and destroyed, alliances formed and dissolved, and social norms enforced without anyone having to put anything in writing. Medieval gossip was also, by all surviving evidence, spectacularly detailed and often entirely wrong. Someone's overheard conversation became a rumour, became a fact, became a scandal, became a thing the local priest felt compelled to address from the pulpit, all within roughly a fortnight. It was the medieval Twitter, and it was brutal. The speed at which gossip travelled through a medieval community was remarkable, given the complete absence of any communication technology beyond the human mouth. A piece of information released at the well in the morning could reach every household in a village by evening, having passed through approximately 14 people and accumulated at least 3 significant embellishments along the way. Each person who transmitted it added inflection, context, and the particular interpretive pressure of their existing feelings about the parties involved, so that by the time the story reached its furthest point, it might share only a loose thematic relationship with what had actually happened. This was not considered a flaw. It was the system working as designed, because the purpose of village gossip was never purely informational. It was social, evaluative, and deeply political in the small-stakes way that all closely observed communities are political. Women were the primary carriers of gossip in medieval reputation, which tells you more about who medieval men were afraid of than about who was actually doing the gossiping. The scold, a woman accused of excessive or malicious talking, was a target of specific legal mechanisms, including the scold's bridle mentioned in other contexts, which was a metal device strapped to the face to prevent speech, and was used almost exclusively on women. The existence of this device confirms 2 things: that speaking women were perceived as dangerous enough to require physical silencing, and that enough women were doing enough speaking of the kind that powerful men found threatening that someone made a whole apparatus about it. The gossip wasn't trivial. It was, in the estimation of the people trying to suppress it, a genuine source of social power. Men gossiped too, of course, in taverns, in guild halls, in the specific register of men discussing other men's business that was never called gossip, and was always something else: news, observation, commentary, professional concern. The medieval double standard about who was allowed to talk about whom, and call it what is not a medieval invention. It is simply documented more clearly in medieval sources because the medieval church wrote down its disapproval of so many things with such exhaustive specificity. Gossip served essential functions that the community depended on. It monitored behaviour against shared standards in the absence of formal enforcement mechanisms that most villages didn't have. It transmitted information about reliability, who kept their agreements, who didn't, who owed debts they weren't repaying, whose livestock kept ending up in other people's fields. It created accountability without institutions. In a world where most legal and economic transactions depended on reputation and personal trust, the management of that reputation through the social conversation was not entertainment with a side of malice. It was infrastructure with a side of entertainment. The malice was real too, naturally. People used gossip to harm rivals, to settle old scores, to express opinions about neighbours that couldn't be said directly. Medieval gossip was not a gentle thing. It was a tool, and it was used accordingly, which is to say it was used exactly the way it is used now, by people who would recognise themselves immediately in each other's behaviour across every century that separates them. Medieval culture had a deep, abiding appreciation for wit, for the well-turned phrase, the clever observation, the riddle that made you groan when you finally got it. Riddle traditions stretching back centuries were collected, written down, traded and used as tests of intelligence, entertainment at feasts and teaching tools in monasteries. Some of the oldest written riddles in English come from the Anglo-Saxon period, and they are, and this is historically accurate, frequently about entirely ordinary objects described in ways that initially sound like something else entirely. A key, a bookworm, a certain kind of farm tool. The medieval riddle tradition was apparently not shy about double meanings, and the fact that monks were among the people writing them down suggests that the clergy had a broader sense of humour than their official communications might imply. Word games, tongue twisters, and verbal sparring contests were popular at every social level, from tavern arguments to courtly debates. The Exeter Book, an anthology of Anglo-Saxon poetry compiled around the 10th century, and surviving as one of the most important documents in Old English literature, contains nearly 100 riddles that range from the elegant to the deliberately provocative. These were not children's puzzles. They were sophisticated literary constructions that asked the reader to hold two completely different interpretations in mind simultaneously: the surface description, which was often written to suggest something inappropriate, and the actual answer, which was invariably something perfectly ordinary: a churning implement, a piece of bread dough. The joke was the contrast, and the joke was apparently hilarious for about 500 years of readers, which tells you something permanent and true about the human relationship to innuendo. At the noble court, verbal wit was a recognised accomplishment, something a well-educated person was expected to be able to perform on demand. The ability to compose a short, clever poem, to respond to a challenge with a quick and sharp reply, to pose a riddle that genuinely stumped the room and then deliver the answer with perfect timing. These were skills that carried genuine social currency. They were also competitive. Court culture ran on reputation, and reputation was partly built in public verbal exchanges where everyone was watching, and the outcome mattered. A lord who could be outmanoeuvred in wordplay by a guest was a lord who had lost something small but visible, and the medieval attention to hierarchy meant that small visible losses accumulated. Debates, formal structured arguments between two positions, were a recognised entertainment form at both the academic and the courtly level. The academic debate had roots in the scholastic tradition of the universities, where disputation was the primary method of intellectual training. Two scholars would take opposing positions on a question. argue them according to formal logical rules, and the quality of the argumentation was assessed both for its logical rigour and its rhetorical elegance. This format filtered into courtly entertainment in a slightly less rigorous version. Debates between spring and winter, between the merits of different flowers, between wine and water, where the serious intellectual form was kept, but the subject was allowed to be delightfully trivial. Tongue twisters and sound games existed in vernacular languages across medieval Europe, passed down orally and occasionally written into manuscripts with the slightly embarrassed annotation that it was for educational purposes, which nobody entirely believed. Puns were common and appreciated, particularly in languages where words with multiple meanings created opportunities for layered expression that a clever speaker could exploit without technically saying anything objectionable. Medieval puns were not considered the lowest form of humour. They were considered a demonstration of linguistic awareness, which is only slightly more dignified but was taken more seriously. What connects all of this? The riddles, the wordplay, the formal debates, the competitive wit, the puns written down by monks who definitely had other things to do, is a culture that genuinely valued intelligence as a form of entertainment. Not the performance of intelligence, not cleverness deployed to intimidate, but the specific pleasure of a mind working in public and producing something that other minds recognized as good. The medieval feast table fell quiet when someone posed a riddle worth considering. The answer, when it came, was met with something between laughter and appreciation that has no precise modern equivalent, but would be completely recognizable to anyone who has ever been in a room when someone said exactly the right thing. The tournament in its most romanticized form involves two knights in gleaming armor charging at each other on horseback, while a crowd of admiring nobles watches and a lady drops a handkerchief from a balcony. The reality was considerably messier, significantly more dangerous, and honestly more exciting. Early tournaments were not the ceremonial events of later centuries. They were closer to controlled battles, with teams of knights engaging in mass combat over wide areas, and the injuries and deaths that resulted were regular enough that the church repeatedly tried to ban them and failed completely. Over time, the format evolved toward individual jousting, which was still extremely dangerous but at least concentrated the violence into a form audiences could follow easily. Tournaments were entertainment on a scale that dwarfed almost everything else available, drawing crowds from miles around, generating betting, commerce, and the particular social electricity of an event where something genuinely unpredictable might happen at any moment. The earliest tournaments, the melee, conducted across open countryside with teams of knights fighting in loose formation, were barely distinguishable from actual warfare, which was precisely the point. They were training exercises dressed as entertainment, or entertainment dressed as training exercises, depending on who was asking and what they needed the answer to be. Knights captured opponents and held them for ransom, exactly as in real combat. Horses were taken, equipment was lost to the winners. The financial stakes were real enough that a skilled tournament knight could build a genuine fortune, and several documented figures did exactly that. Men of modest means who rode from tournament to tournament across France and England, accumulating prize money, ransomed opponents, and a reputation that eventually attracted noble patronage. William Marshall, who rose from relatively obscure origins to become one of the most powerful men in England, built his early reputation and resources largely through tournament success. He understood that the tournament was not a game, it was a market. The audience at a major tournament was enormous by medieval standards. Thousands of people gathered over several days, camping in the surrounding fields, filling every available lodging within travelling distance, and generating an economic activity that made tournament towns temporarily prosperous. The outer ring of the tournament ground was lined with stalls and merchants who had travelled specifically for the occasion. Food vendors, ale sellers, armourers offering repairs, horse traders, and the full range of entertainers and opportunists who followed large crowds everywhere. The tournament was a fair, a market, a military display, and a social occasion simultaneously, and the combination produced an atmosphere that contemporary description suggests was genuinely overwhelming in its scale and noise. The joust, individual mounted combat with lances across a barrier, emerged as the dominant tournament form by the 13th century, and was refined progressively into something that balanced spectacle and danger in a ratio that kept audiences excited without killing participants quite so regularly. The barrier, called the tilt, was introduced partly to keep the horses from colliding and partly to give each rider a clear lane, which had the effect of making the collision of two men on horseback at combined speeds of significant force into something you could watch with a clear sight line. The impact of a direct hit, lance splintering against armour, rider rocked backward in the saddle or unhorsed entirely, was an experience that people travelled considerable distances to witness in person. The sound alone was unlike anything else. Women attended tournaments, and their presence was not incidental to the social function of the event. The convention of the tournament as a performance of masculine excellence before a female audience, knights competing for the honour of a chosen lady, displaying courage and skill in a context that had both martial and romantic dimensions, was not entirely fictional. It reflected a genuine social dynamic in which the tournament was one of the few large, mixed-sex public events, and the presence of women in the stands changed the quality of the performance in ways that the participants were entirely aware of. When a knight fell, and they fell regularly, sometimes seriously, the crowd's reaction was not the polite concern of a golf audience watching a player miss a putt. It was immediate, loud, and physical. The tournament crowd understood what they were watching, understood the real bodies inside the real armour, and their response to genuine danger was the response of people who had not separated themselves behind layers of mediation from the reality of what sport at its most serious actually involves. The tournament was entertainment, absolutely. But the stakes were real, and everyone in the stands knew it. That knowledge was inseparable from the excitement, and possibly was the excitement. Here is something that gets lost in the reverent treatment of the past. Medieval people were funny, not accidentally funny, not funny because they were naive funny, but deliberately, craftily, wickedly funny, with a particular gift for insults that combined creativity, specificity, and a willingness to go much further than most modern sensibilities would consider reasonable. Medieval insults were not vague, they were personal, physical, detailed, and delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about exactly what to say. They were also frequently poetic. The most cutting remarks in medieval literature have a rhythmic quality, a structure that suggests they were composed rather than improvised. This was a culture where wit was power, where the ability to make a crowd laugh at someone was a genuine social weapon, and where the person who could land the sharpest line in front of witnesses had won something real. The flyting tradition, a formal exchange of insults between two parties, conducted in verse before an audience, was practiced across medieval Northern Europe and represents one of the most extraordinary intersections of comedy, aggression, and literary craft in the history of human entertainment. Two participants would trade increasingly elaborate insults in escalating rounds, each building on the previous exchange, the audience judging both the content and the execution, with the winner determined by who ran out of creativity first. This was not shouting. It was composed, performed, competitive verbal art with the specific social stakes of a public contest. Old Norse literature preserves examples that are simultaneously extremely funny and technically sophisticated. The Lokasena, in which the god Loki trades insults with the other Norse gods at a feast, is essentially the earliest surviving example of a roast. The jester, the professional fool of medieval courts, was an institution built entirely around the license to say things that nobody else could say. The jester's official social function was to entertain, but his practical social function was to articulate what everyone was thinking about the people in power and deliver it in a form that could be laughed at rather than punished. A good jester needed the comedian's instinct for the exact right thing to say at the exact right moment, combined with the courtier's understanding of which lines could be crossed and which would get him thrown out, or worse. Several documented jesters pushed the second category too far and discovered the limits of royal tolerance at considerable personal cost. The ones who survived long careers understood something essential, that the funniest truth is the one the powerful cannot quite bring themselves to deny. Fabliaux, the comic short story tradition in medieval French literature, widely translated and adapted across Europe, built its entire appeal on the comedy of types being taken down, the pompous husband outwitted, the arrogant clergyman exposed, the noble whose pretensions met reality, the merchant whose greed created a trap he walked into himself. These stories were not subtle and were not trying to be. They were the medieval equivalent of the sketch comedy format, a recognizable type placed in a situation designed to expose the gap between their self-image and reality, with the resolution providing the audience the satisfaction of watching pretension collapse. They were enormously popular across every social level, which tells you that the pleasure of watching the self-important brought low is one of the most durable pleasures in human entertainment history. Chaucer understood all of this with complete clarity. The Canterbury Tales is full of characters who are funny and characters who are being laughed at, and the line between these two categories shifts constantly, which is part of what makes the work so alive. The Miller's Tale is a masterclass in the medieval comic tradition. Physical, specific, cruel, in the way that genuinely funny things are often cruel, and constructed with a precision of timing that repays analysis. Chaucer was writing for an audience that understood comedy as a craft and judged it accordingly. They laughed when it was good, and they knew when it wasn't, and Chaucer was very good. What all of this comedy had in common, the flyting, the jester's barbs, the fabliaux, the wicked observation delivered over ale, was a quality of aliveness. It was humour that engaged with the specific, the physical, the real. It named things. It noticed things. It pointed at the gap between how people presented themselves and what they actually were, and it did this in public, in front of witnesses, in the specifically human way that has always been both the most dangerous and the most necessary form of honesty available to us. You might assume that in a world where you ate with your hands from a shared bowl while sitting on a bench next to someone who had not bathed since autumn, the rules of table behaviour were minimal. You would be wrong. Medieval feasting etiquette was extensive, written down in manuals called courtesy books, and taken seriously enough that children of the nobility were explicitly educated in it, and adults who violated it were genuinely judged. You were not supposed to talk with your mouth full. You were not supposed to reach across someone else to grab food. You were not supposed to scratch yourself at table, wipe your nose on the tablecloth, or belch without at least covering your mouth. Whether all of these rules were followed in practice is a separate question from whether they existed, and they absolutely existed, suggesting that people needed reminding, which suggests in turn that the things they were being reminded not to do were happening regularly. The courtesy book genre was a serious literary category in medieval Europe, producing texts with names like the Bubby's Book and the Book of Courtesy in England and the equivalents across the continent, all aimed at communicating a code of behaviour that was simultaneously practical, social, and deeply political. Knowing the rules of table behaviour was a marker of social status. It demonstrated education, breeding, and the kind of upbringing that only certain backgrounds produced. Not knowing the rules, or knowing them imperfectly, was a signal that could be read by everyone present. The courtesy book's purpose was to close that gap for people who were moving up, who needed to perform the manners of a class they were entering rather than the one they had come from. It was, in the most pragmatic sense, a guide to passing. The mechanics of medieval eating required more active management than modern dining, which partly explains why so many rules were needed. The trencher, a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate, which absorbed the juices of whatever was placed on it, and was either eaten at the end of the meal or given to the poor, required handling that kept it functional as a surface. Shared dishes meant that the way you took food from a communal platter said something specific about your character. Taking too much, taking the best pieces before others, using your hands in ways that contaminated what others would eat, all were observable and judged. The shared cup passed between diners created its own set of obligations about how to drink from it without leaving it unpleasantly for the next person. Carving, the formal cutting and presentation of meat at table, was a specialized skill with its own vocabulary and its own manual tradition, separate from general courtesy instruction. The carver at a noble table was performing in public, and the ability to break down a roasted bird or joint of meat according to correct procedure, using the correct terminology for each cut on each animal, and presenting the portions in the correct order to the correct people according to their rank was a genuine accomplishment. Carving manuals exist that read like technical documents for a very specific and socially loaded form of performance. Getting it wrong was the table equivalent of mispronouncing an important word in front of people who knew the correct pronunciation. The salt cellar, a large decorative container of salt placed at a specific point on the table, functioned as a social dividing line. Sitting above the salt meant proximity to the host and high social status. Sitting below the salt meant the opposite. This was not a subtle or deniable signal. Everyone at the table knew immediately where they stood relative to everyone else, encoded in their position relative to a condiment container. The phrase below the salt has survived in English as an idiom for low social status, precisely because the original practice was so universally understood that the phrase needs no explanation even to people who have never seen a medieval feast layout. That is a remarkable longevity for a table arrangement. And yet beneath all the rules, the manuals, the hierarchical seating, the specialized carving vocabulary, the shared trenchers and the carefully managed shared cups, beneath all of it was the same thing that makes people gather around tables in every culture and every century. The food, the warmth, the company, the specific pleasure of being fed in the presence of other people being fed, which is one of the oldest and most reliable human pleasures there is. The rules were real. The pleasure under the rules was realer. In a world where the boundary between the spiritual and the material was far more permeable than it is today, visiting the shrine of a saint was not a dry religious obligation. It was an experience, charged, emotional, often physically intense, and surrounded by the kind of atmosphere that today we might associate with a major cultural event. Shrines attracted crowds. Crowds attracted vendors, performers, and everyone who understood that where people gathered in large numbers, commerce and entertainment followed. But the experience at the centre of it all, the actual encounter with the relic, the moment of prayer, the reported miracles, the people arriving sick and leaving with testimony of something inexplicable, carried an electric quality that contemporary accounts consistently describe as genuinely extraordinary. Whether you believe in miracles or not, the social reality of them, the testimonies, the weeping, the shared witnessing, produce something that functioned like collective catharsis on a scale that not much else in medieval life could match. The relic, a fragment of bone, a piece of clothing, an object associated with a saint, occupied a position in medieval culture that is difficult to map onto any modern equivalent because it combined the functions of tourist attraction, healing centre, legal oath site, and direct hotline to divine power all in one small, usually elaborately housed object. Major relics were the most valuable possessions a church could hold. They attracted pilgrims, which attracted donations, which funded construction and maintenance, which created buildings that attracted more pilgrims in a cycle that produced the great cathedral cities of medieval Europe. Canterbury existed as it did because Thomas Becket was martyred there. Santiago de Compostela existed as it did because the bones attributed to the Apostle James were there. The relic was not incidental to the medieval city, it was the reason. The experience of approaching a major shrine was deliberately managed as a journey of escalating intensity. The approach road to Canterbury, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela was lined with smaller shrines, chapels, and sacred markers that conditioned the pilgrim's attention over miles and hours. By the time you reached the main shrine, you'd been walking in a state of focused sacred attention for days or weeks. The final approach was often on your knees. The shrine itself was designed to overwhelm, encased in gold and jewels, lit by hundreds of candles, visible at the end of a long dark nave that made the light around it feel supernatural. The emotional response that people describe in their accounts of this moment, the weeping, the inability to speak, the sense of something beyond ordinary experience, is entirely credible as the natural result of weeks of physical effort, deprivation, and focused intention arriving at a carefully designed sensory climax. Miracles at shrines were recorded formally. Custodians kept books of testimonies, accounts of healings, of prayers answered, of recoveries from conditions that had seemed hopeless. These records were not literary exercises. They were legal documents in the sense that a saint's canonization required verified miracles, and the testimonies were taken with the seriousness of evidence. The people who gave them were describing their own experiences under no obligation to perform enthusiasm that wasn't there, and many of the accounts have the specific quality of real experience rather than polished narrative. The uncertainty, the before and after, the remaining questions alongside the central inexplicable fact. What the shrine offered that nothing else in medieval life quite matched was the specific experience of a very large number of people, sharing a very intense emotional state in a very beautiful space at the same time. The collective quality of shrine devotion, hundreds of pilgrims all having made versions of the same journey, all arriving at the same sacred object with versions of the same hope, produced something that was simultaneously very private and deeply shared. You were alone with your prayer and surrounded by everyone else's prayers, and the building held them all without favouring any of them. In a life that was often isolated, difficult, and short on beauty, this was not a minor thing. It was for many people the most extraordinary experience of their lives, and they walked hundreds of miles for it, which tells you everything you need to know about what it meant. There is a particular kind of human genius that takes something that has to be done and figures out how to make it worth looking forward to. In the medieval world, certain labour-intensive seasonal tasks, the harvest, the shearing of sheep, the slaughtering of pigs in autumn, the pressing of grapes in wine-producing regions, were turned into communal events with the explicit understanding that everyone was going to work hard, and then everyone was going to celebrate hard, and that these two things were inseparable. The harvest in particular was a social occasion as much as an agricultural one, with whole villages working neighbouring fields together, singing as they worked, competing informally to see who could fill their cart fastest, and culminating in the harvest festival that was one of the genuine high points of the rural calendar. The labour was real and exhausting, but the company made it something else entirely. The harvest was not simply a practical necessity. It was an event with its own emotional shape, its own rituals and its own social obligations that the community had developed over generations into something that carried meaning beyond the agricultural. The pace of harvesting was governed by weather that could not be predicted or controlled, which meant that when conditions were right, everyone worked at maximum intensity for as long as the conditions held. There was no such thing as a harvest that could be done gradually or piecemeal. The grain was ready when it was ready, and the window between ripe and ruined by rain could be narrow. This created a genuine urgency that made the communal labour feel like collective action against a shared threat, which it was, and the solidarity that this produced was real and was felt. Work songs, rhythmic, repetitive, adaptable, accompanied the repetitive physical tasks of harvest labour in the way that music always accompanies work that benefits from synchronized movement and needs the hours to pass. The songs weren't necessarily beautiful or complex. They were functional first and entertaining second. The rhythm calibrated to the rhythm of the work, the familiar melody allowing attention to split between singing and doing without either suffering. They were also a form of communication in noisy outdoor settings, a way of knowing where other workers were, of coordinating effort across a large field, of maintaining a sense of connected group activity even when individuals were spread across considerable distances. You could hear the singing from the far end of the field and know you were not alone in what you were doing. The custom of crying the neck, the ceremonial cutting of the last sheaf of the harvest, often with specific rituals and the collective shout of the assembled workers, marked the completion of the main harvest with a formality that elevated it beyond mere task completion. The last sheaf was sometimes kept, plaited into decorative forms, and preserved in the farmhouse as a talisman for the next year's growth. The rituals varied by region, by village, by family tradition, but the underlying impulse was consistent, to mark the end of the most important communal effort of the year with something that acknowledged its significance. This mattered. It had been hard. Everyone knew it. Marking it mattered too. The celebration that followed, the harvest supper, laid on by the landowner or organised communally depending on local custom, was one of the most genuine feasts of the year because it was earned in the specific way that made the eating meaningful. Food tasted different after the harvest was in. It tasted like the work done and the winter secured, like the collective effort of everyone present measured in full barns and an empty field. The drinking was deeper, and the singing was louder because the anxiety that had been running underneath everything for weeks had lifted. The crop was in. The gamble had paid. For one evening at least, the medieval agricultural world contained something very close to uncomplicated relief and joy, shared by everyone who had been in the field together, and that was worth celebrating as completely as anyone knew how. Not everything medieval people did for pleasure was loud, communal or competitive. Gardens were a genuine source of delight for monasteries, which cultivated them with serious botanical knowledge and spiritual intention. For nobles, who commissioned elaborate pleasure gardens with fountains, arbours and flowering plants, arranged with the same aesthetic care they applied to their great halls. And increasingly for ordinary townspeople, who tended small herb plots and flower patches with a proprietary pride that required no social audience to sustain it. Garden design manuals existed. Debates about which flowers were most beautiful were conducted in writing. Medieval poetry about gardens and spring flowers was a recognised genre. In a world that was frequently cold, dark, malodorous and muddy, a garden in bloom was not a minor thing. It was evidence that beauty was possible, that the world could be arranged into something pleasing, and that this was worth the effort of making it happen. The monastic garden was the most sophisticated version of the medieval garden tradition, and it was sophisticated in the way that things are when they are taken seriously by intelligent people over many generations. Monasteries maintained multiple distinct garden spaces, the physic garden for medicinal herbs, the kitchen garden for food, the cloister garth for contemplation, and the knowledge accumulated in these gardens about plant properties, cultivation techniques, and seasonal management was among the most advanced practical science of the medieval world. Monks wrote about their gardens with a specificity and enthusiasm that goes well beyond what professional obligation requires. They named individual plants. They described their properties and peculiarities. They compared varieties and noted which performed better in which conditions. This was not merely record-keeping. It was the written expression of genuine interest, the kind of attention that only develops in people who actually care. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, composer, mystic, and natural philosopher, wrote extensively about plants and their properties in terms that wove together botanical observation, medical application, and spiritual meaning in a way that treated the garden as a text about divine creation. Her descriptions of individual plants are vivid enough to identify specific species, detailed enough to be medically informative, and invested enough with personal attention to suggest that the garden was for her, as for many medieval monastics, a primary site of encounter with the natural world as an expression of something larger. The garden was not a hobby. It was a form of knowing. Pleasure gardens in noble contexts were designed with explicit aesthetic intention to produce visual beauty, pleasant scent, and the specific sensory experience of being in a space that had been made for enjoyment rather than productivity. The turf seat, a raised bench of packed earth covered with growing grass or low herbs, warm and fragrant in summer, was a feature of noble gardens described in design literature and depicted in manuscript illustrations, with a frequency that suggests it was genuinely popular and genuinely used. The medieval pleasure garden was meant to be sat in, walked through, and experienced with the full range of senses. Trellised arbours provided shade and the particular pleasantness of being slightly enclosed by growing things. Raised flower beds contained plants selected as much for fragrance as for appearance. Small fountains provided sound. The garden in medieval literature served as the primary setting for romance and private conversation. The enclosed space outside the hall, where characters could speak without being overheard, where the normal social supervision of indoor life was relaxed, where the season and the flowers provided a backdrop that turned ordinary encounters into something more significant. Whether real gardens were used the way literary gardens were used is a question that the sources answer mostly by implication, and occasionally with a specificity that suggests they were. The medieval garden was private in a world with very little privacy. That made it precious in ways that went well beyond horticulture. And so here we are, at the end of a day that never really ended badly at all. Because tonight's story wasn't about suffering, not really. It was about something quieter and more stubborn than that. It was about people finding the gaps in a hard life and filling them with music, with laughter, with a well-placed insult delivered to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, with a game of chess that went on too long, with a dance in a churchyard on a May morning before the dew had dried. Medieval people didn't have much. By our standards, they had almost nothing. No central heating, no painkillers, no hot showers, no way to skip to the next song or pause the moment when it got too heavy. They had the fire, the field, the village, and each other. And from those ingredients, simple, impermanent, often uncomfortable, they built something that looked, in its best hours, remarkably like joy. They sang when the work was done, they danced when the music started, they told stories that made the darkness outside the firelight feel smaller. They sat in gardens and thought about beautiful things. They loved their dogs with the specific, uncomplicated tenderness that dogs have always earned. They made each other laugh until it hurt, and they held the laughter carefully, the way you hold something you know is going to have to last. And the riddles. Don't forget the riddles. Because a culture that spends its evenings trying to make each other think is a culture that hasn't given up on the pleasure of being alive. There is a version of medieval history that is only plague and poverty, and the particular grimness of a world without antibiotics. That version is true, but it is not the whole truth, and tonight you heard the rest of it. The part that didn't make it into the official records because nobody thought to write down that the harvest supper was wonderful this year, that the jester said something that made the Lord laugh so hard he spilled his wine, that the children were playing in the street until it got dark and nobody wanted to call them in. Those moments happened. They happened in 10,000 villages across 500 years, in firelight and festival light, and the particular golden light of a late summer afternoon when the grain was in and the winter felt far away. They happened, and then they were gone, the way all moments are gone, leaving only the faint impression of themselves in the archaeology, and the manuscripts and the margins of illuminated books where someone drew a rabbit playing a lute for no reason, except that it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was a good idea. It always was. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of wherever you are, in your heated room with your soft mattress and your indoor plumbing and your access to essentially all the music ever recorded, take a moment to feel the distance between your life and theirs, and then take another moment to feel how small that distance actually is. They wanted what you have: warmth, rest, company, a story that carries you somewhere else for a while. You have all of it, every night, without thinking about it. Maybe that's worth something. Maybe that's worth everything. Rest now. The fire is banked. The bells have rung. The village is quiet. And somewhere in the distance, very faintly, someone is still playing a hurdy-gurdy badly but with great enthusiasm, and honestly, good for them. Good night.